So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to our highest attended webinar of 2024. So welcome and really pleased you've made the time, especially with Thanksgiving just around the corner. For those of you that haven't joined before, you will see that we have a chat box at the bottom of your screens. We do encourage you all to use your chat box for any questions for Mary, and also I'm sure at times we'll open the mics and Mary might ask you questions during the session. We do record today's session, so I will send that to you all afterwards. And just a reminder that this session, along with all our webinars, is available on our IACC On Demand webinar page and our IACC YouTube channel. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mary Floor from Master Connection Associates, who's going to be doing today's session around how to rebook business after a meeting while on site. So Mary, take it away. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, perfect. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Mary from Master Connection Associates. Super excited today to be talking to you about a topic that I'm really passionate about, which is how can we rebook business after we have a meeting, directly on site. As Kate had said, there's a couple of different ways that you can go ahead and interact. The first thing is I like to say, if you want to get on camera, please get on camera. I'd love to see your faces. I see a lot of you haven't muted yourself, which is perfectly fine, but please feel free to turn on your camera so we can see your face. It's always nice to talk to a face. And as Kate has said, there's a couple of different ways that we can go ahead and interact with you. So the first way is right into the chat box. There are going to be some times. I'll go ahead and type right in the chat box right now. There will be some times I will go ahead and ask you to type into the chat box some of your questions or some of your ideas or thoughts through some of these exercises we will go through in the next hour. And the other way that you can also go ahead and interact is there is a reactions button that you have access to on the Zoom, and you can actually raise your hand or do a little fun emoji. And if you raise your hand, I can go ahead and pause and unmute and get you to talk just right there. So then we can unmute and talk and ask your question. So we will go ahead and begin. And there's kind of three main things that we are going to talk about today. The first thing is when we look at rebooking people on site, we do want to talk about what are some of those best practices to rebook a client while they're on property, which typically starts right at the beginning of the sales process. But in addition to it beginning at the beginning of the sales process, we also know that a lot of times our operations team has a huge impact on how we can maximize opportunities to work better together to rebook these clients. But in addition to rebooking these clients, we also have to look at really uncovering what we like to say their real feedback is about our conference center. And I think a lot of times when we do post-cons or we call clients and we ask them for their feedback after, or even at the end of the meeting when they're leaving, we ask for some of that feedback, but we actually don't get sometimes to what the root cause of whatever the issue the root cause of whatever that issue may be. And a lot of people will look you in the eyes and go, yeah, everything is great, when really it's actually not so great. So we have to make sure that we're really making sure that our clients are leaving happy, which will hopefully then lead to actually rebooking. So we are going to start right at the beginning of the sales process because, as I said, rebooking does start right at the beginning. And what we find is that when a lead actually comes in, and as Kate and I were just chatting even right now for a couple of minutes, we know a lot of you are really busy, which is a really great thing. But because we're so busy, when a lead sometimes comes in, most salespeople really fail to dig deep and beyond the customer's immediate need for whatever that initial meeting or type of business that they're actually asking about is. We really don't go beyond sometimes our areas of expertise to ask about maybe other meetings or events or holiday parties, or really ask the questions, maybe not your first question, obviously, but who else within your company or organization does plan meetings or events, or how often do you actually have this meeting or an event? So at the end of the day, when you start with rebooking, it also starts with a really well-oiled sales process. So one thing that we know, and this came directly from Cvent a couple of years ago, this isn't a recent statistic, But Stephen put out a statistic a couple of years ago that said, what is the number one reason a person, a meeting planner that filled out this survey, number one reason you would not return to a venue? And the number one reason was the lack of professionalism from the hotel sales staff.
Wow.
Sales staff, not necessarily the operation staff. It came from the sales. So when that lead actually comes in, we do actually have to ask a lot of questions. We have to engage. We have to be curious and make sure that we actually take very, very good notes and listen for some of those clues, right? So today we're not going through our probing funnel, which some of you are familiar with. We've covered this in other webinars of how to ask good questions, but you do have to think about what are the questions I can ask, one, not only to uncover the client's needs, but also about future business. But one of these things right here that I love, the more you know about their attitude towards you and your product is very critical. Because if I don't even know their attitude towards booking a conference center, then it is going to be very difficult to actually rebook this client. So the attitude of your product, I like to use simple things. You know, maybe they love all-inclusive pricing. Maybe they actually don't love all-inclusive pricing. Maybe they're choosing you because you're the only place that had availability over their dates, and that's why they're choosing you. And maybe they actually don't have a positive attitude about our products or the services that we're offering or the way that we do things at IACC. Or maybe they do have a really positive experience about utilizing, you know, all of our conference center and what it actually offers there. So once you actually understand their attitude, I guarantee you your chances of actually successfully rebooking them have actually increased dramatically. You know, even like a little fun example. If you think about yourself and you can just, if you want to give a little reaction to this, like who in this room loves to drink like really nice wine? And you could just like do a little reaction if you like to drink nice wine. Because I know people that love, thanks, Pernille, it's like nice hearts, right? I love to drink nice wine. So when anybody is trying to sell me on a nice bottle of wine, my attitude towards it is pretty positive. Those of you that are like, I just drink any type of wine, it doesn't necessarily matter. Well, guess what? Well, when a salesperson, you sit down at a restaurant and they're trying to upsell you on a really fancy bottle, your attitude just towards the product makes that a little bit difficult, right? So that's really, really critical to go beyond just the requirements of the dates, the number of people, you know, are you doing team building activities? You know, all of those basics, but really looking at how do I build rapport and make this very conversational, especially if the person does cite you. You know, if they cite you and come on a site tour, then you can look at what are some of their hot buttons. You have that ability to ask some of those questions because rebooking often begins with understanding your customer's needs. Let me give another example. Let's say if they do want to do a fun team building and now they've selected like, what do they want to do for their team building? Well, you can be starting to talk about next year's event and some of the items that they could do for team building since we have such a variety of activities. It's not just like we have one thing that we can offer. We have multiple things that we can offer in order to make this team building event much different than it actually was last year. So what that means though, is that you got to be a really good listener. You know, you have two ears and one mouth for a reason. So you got to listen for the opportunities. And what I find is that clients today, they are dropping hints of what they like, of what they need, of what they prefer. You know, you got to be listening for those opportunities. And then that way you can actually create some opportunities for the future. As I just said, if I'm digging into, well, tell me a little bit more about the team building and what have you done in
Hi,
the
it's
past?
Sue. How are you? Hey, I just wanted to see if you
Go on and mute her. What are some of those, creating those opportunities? Sorry about that, lost my train of thought. But if I am digging deeper into the team building of, well, share with me a little bit more about, you know, what do you want to do for the team building and what is important within food and beverage? You can give them an array of options that they're going to have to actually rebook with you because they couldn't possibly do everything at your conference center or even within your destination. So that's kind of where that really starts. So when you look at asking more questions from the beginning, here are just some examples, and I'm going to ask you in just a moment if you could type into the chat box some of the questions that you actually like to ask as it relates to understanding if there's a rebooking opportunity. But for example, where have you planned this meeting in the past? How many meetings and events do you plan each year? What other meetings do you plan? Who else in your company plans meetings, events, holiday parties? What other departments meet? How far out do you usually plan this meeting? If we are trying to rebook this exact meeting, this would be a perfect question. Like, how far out? When do you start the planning process? For some of you, if you're actually looking at rebooking the meeting, let's say right now in November, well, it's November, almost December, and they might already be at the planning stage for next November's meeting. So we have to actually have a really good idea of what that booking window actually is. So just right now in the chat box, Kate had kind of mentioned this, and Kara typed in to the chat box. I typed in the chat box. If you could just go ahead and type in, what questions do you like to ask to uncover if there is a rebooking need? How do we uncover if this is just a one and done, or is there actually just kind of a rebooking need just in general? And as we do that, does anybody want to unmute? And maybe Pernille, since you're on camera and I can see you so wonderfully and I so appreciate it, why don't you go ahead and unmute? What are some of the questions you like to ask to uncover rebooking needs? And go ahead, the rest of you can type those in.
I'm quite new at this. I actually only have been working with this for 3 months. So I'm quite new at this. So I'm just listening and picking up all your very good ideas about it, because I'm quite new. So I'm just
Okay, perfect. That's okay. We won't put you right on the spot there. Thanks for sharing. And then if you are new, Pernille, and for the others of you, you could copy and paste these items into the chat box and type those right into your, right into your repertoire of questions to ask. So I see some really good questions. Nicola said, what's the most important factor of a venue for you? I think it's Jeannie. This is a great question because we're going to get into this. What has been your attendee feedback from past events like this one? And then we got a couple, is it's an annual event? I always like to say, how often do you have this event? So, because sometimes that yes or no question can just shut that down. And they might say, no, it's not an annual event. We do it quarterly, or we do it every single year. Sue, this is so great. If you are negotiating with the client, I would say this would also be a great this for that close. We call this negotiating or quid pro quo, where you can actually say, would you be interested in looking at a multi-year proposal? Of course, Sue, if it's a good piece of business. But again, would you like to go ahead and sign a multi-year contract? And if so, we may be able to offer something, right? We may be able to offer a little bit lower rate or a little bit lower pricing structure in that case. Erin had said, what is the feedback, pros and cons on what we can do different for next year? Allison, have you had good feedback from your delegates so far? I always like to say, what has been the feedback? And again, we'll get into that. Cindy, what are you hoping to accomplish with your meeting? So all great questions. So again, we'd encourage you that if you have that really great questions that you've asked right from the beginning, it is going to make that rebooking just so much easier if we have a really great relationship. And what I find right now is we're just so busy. We're just running, that we're actually not slowing down and actually picking up the phone and asking some of these questions to start the relationship right from the beginning. Now, when it does come from rebooking, a couple other things to remember is that actually when clients are not turned off by a hard sell. So sometimes you can just assume that they actually want to rebook. This is kind of even, Sue, like yours could be a kind of almost an assumptive close here. It's just, could we go ahead and look at a rebooking deal or a multi-year proposal or a multi-year contract so that we can go ahead and make this as easy as possible for you? And what we actually find is that consumer research actually indicates that the customer today is not actually turned off by a hard sell. See, at the end of the day, if you don't ask, you don't receive. So when it does come to rebooking, all you have to simply do is just ask, can we go ahead and rebook for next year? Could we go ahead and look at the dates for next year? Again, can we move forward with the proposal for next year as we start to solidify the dates? Because actually clients, they don't see us as pushy. They don't necessarily see us as aggressive. What they actually see us as is they see us as helpful because they actually appreciate the convenience and the options that are presented to them during the booking process. Back to the attitude of the product, and your service and what it is offered. The other thing that's very important to know is, is this a savvy planner or is this a brand new planner? Because, a brand new planner would actually appreciate all of the options that they actually have. A brand new planner is actually going to be happy that you've actually shared, like, oh, I'm not even thinking about next year, but let's go ahead and get that solidified and taken care of now. And so that actually is providing what we like to say is real-time total service. Okay. So when it does come to real-time total service, the other thing you have to remember is the better questions that I ask, the more options that I can give to the client by offering more solutions. And at the end of the day, you know more about your space, you know more about your audio visual, you know more about what your conference center can actually offer than the clients do. So even after they've solidified, and we're going to get into the turnover process in just a moment or two, but even after they've solidified what they're going to do for this meeting, what, let's say the setup's going to be and what the audio visual is going to look like and the agenda, well, you can starting to share things and opportunities that they can do for the following year, because that's going to make my life as a planner a lot more convenient. And some of you would also say right now that, some of the planners we work with, and I think some of you may be feeling this, are still very savvy. But I'm also working with, in our industry too, we're working with a lot of new planners that actually don't know what they're doing and don't know how to select, let's say, the right audio visual for them or the right setup for what that meeting is. So again, we want to make sure that it is our responsibility to share all of those different opportunities in order to be successful. The other thing that consumer research actually shows us is that this actually increases the satisfaction of the client because you're meeting more than one need. We also know that when your operations team, and we're going to get into the turnover process in just a moment, when your operations team is actually working with this client and they're starting to detail out the meeting, we know that this is just more revenue of a captivated audience. Somebody that has to pick up your phone calls because we have to get all of those details. And so it's already a captured audience. So why wouldn't we continue to promote that loyalty to keep all the business on the books? Now, from a prospecting standpoint, we have a lot of people from around the world. And I was just working with a bigger hotel client just last week. And one thing that I know is that right now, it's the holiday season. People are gearing up for Christmas, which is great. But overall, leads are kind of down just a little bit. So everybody's trying to think about their outbound prospecting efforts, right? How do I actually pick up the phone and recall back all of my clients that actually haven't booked? And so this is something that, why wouldn't I actually have a forward strategy and mindset to be rebooking this during the sales process, not necessarily after the meeting? And I'll just use an example where even for a client of ours, this was with a corporate client, where we did a lot of the meeting planning for the client. And they signed off and everything. I've gotten like 5 or 6 phone calls from a salesperson of a hotel. This is a hotel in the US, trying to rebook me for the following year. When I was on site with this person, I never saw the salesperson. I never saw really the conference services individual. Nobody came over and greeted me at all. But now you're calling me and calling me and calling me. So if you are on site, you do have to make sure that how do we keep the competition at arm's length is you have to be down there showing some of your face, right? And make sure that you're asking questions and setting up dates and time that you're actually going to follow up with this customer. Because the second they leave, everybody goes back to being very busy. And as Aaron just put into the chat box right now, prospecting is easier during the holiday season because people are just nicer, right? And I would say that they're nicer, but I would also say that people have a lot more time to actually talk to you. Like that's how I would actually be wording this. It's like we have a lot more time on our hands. But I would be remiss if we didn't talk about operations role within the rebooking process and how we actually turn over to the operations team. And what I actually find is, sometimes sales, we just talked about sales asking all of these great questions. Sometimes sales, you do a phenomenal job. You ask all the right questions. We uncover all the opportunities, all of the things you should be doing. We close the deal seamlessly. But if we actually don't have good communication, when we actually turn over that piece of business to our operations team, then poof, all that hard work goes right out the door. So nothing is more annoying to a planner when, let's say, somebody in sales does ask all the right questions, but then it gets turned over to operations and operations asks all the same questions you already asked. It is very clear when you can tell when sales and operations doesn't actually talk, right? So we do have to look at how do we work as one team and make sure that there is ongoing communication between each of these departments, which usually means, and I hate to say another meeting, but if this is a big piece of business, if we know that we really want to rebook this piece of business, then we better be having a conversation with whoever the on-site contact is on our side, on the conference center side, about how we're actually going to do that. So obviously, once it is definite, it's being assigned immediately. And we have to make sure that all of your notes in your CRM are just picture perfect, right? Because it can't be up here. See, if you're actually not writing down notes during this whole sales process, it is going to be really difficult to uncover what were some of those hot buttons, what were some of those implied needs. We also want to make sure that we are arming our operations team with things that they can actually upsell on. So for example, if there are going to be any offsite activities, our operations team should be focusing on how do we get that offsite team building activity back on site, if that's the case. Or if they did book something outside of the conference center, how do we bring that back on site in order to make sure that they do have a successful program, but we're identifying those ways that we can enhance their overall client experience. The other thing I like to say about sales in general is that sales doesn't have as much knowledge sometimes on space challenges, and that's okay. That's not necessarily your job, but we do have to have a conversation with our operations team, with our services team to go, okay, where are some of these operational challenges or space challenges, and what changes do we need to make in order to make sure that there's no issues as we start to detail this out? Now, when it comes to file turnover and it comes to rebooking, I mentioned the professionalism of the hotel sales staff. We want to make sure that the introduction to the services team is so seamless. What I find is that, because we are working with a lot of conference services teams right now, is that a lot of times it just quickly gets turned over to service. There's no conversation with the salesperson. I hear this from services all the time. There's no conversation. Then what services does is they just send a blanket email over to the client that says, dear so-and-so, and it's just a copy and paste of, this is when I need your rooming list. This is when we need this. This is when we need that. It's so functional. So we don't want to be the conference center that is just functional. What we want to do is make sure that when we are turning things over, that it's actually a true experience, right? And so In order to create an true experience, there has to be a very firm introduction. And I might not do this for every piece of business, every small little piece of business, but we can't also just focus on the functionality. What any professional would actually do is, if I'm the salesperson and I have the client on the phone with whoever's now going to handle the account, is I would arrange an introduction call, right? With myself, the client, and the services person. And in that introduction call, I like to say we don't want to wait. Like, this happens within, I like to say like 24 hours of whatever booking is. Well, it's fresh on your mind. You're emailing them and thanking them for the business if you just got that first deposit or whatever the contract is. Now I want to wisp it over so I'm not as involved anymore too from a time management standpoint. But all you want to say is, what I want to do is set up a 10-minute phone appointment with you. I'd always encourage you to do this over Zoom or Teams. Always very important, because when people see your face, I always make a joke, they're just nicer. It's kind of like what Erin said about prospecting during the holiday season. People are just nicer when they see your smile and they see your energy. They're just nicer in general. But then I set up that call to introduce whoever the services or operations team member is that's taking over their account. And what I want to do is close the gap on these calls between what the client expects and what we're actually going to offer too. See, how many times do things get turned over and the client says, well, that's not what the salesperson told me. They told me something completely different than what you're telling me. We know that a savvy planner can utilize that. So we want to make sure there's no communication gaps. So what a true professional does is we'd get on the phone and go, we're so excited that you just confirmed the booking with us. What I want to do is go ahead and introduce you to your new contact on site. It's actually going to be Sue. And then I can review back some of the things that we talked about, some of the hot buttons. So I would say, I had shared with Sue, these were the things that were really important to you. Let's go back through the agenda, not the full agenda if it's a very complicated program, but I want to make sure that nothing has even changed since we last spoke, to make sure that the client has actually now heard that I've communicated all of this messaging to the operations team. And then you can turn it over to the services or operations team, your conference services team, to introduce all of those details, all the functionality, what their next steps are, when they're going to set up a phone call to ask them other questions. Maybe you stay on that portion of the call, maybe you don't. And that's what a professional does. Now, there are going to be times where clients are going to say, well, I don't have time to get on the phone with you, just email it to me. We find that a lot with experienced planners. Well, that's perfectly okay. I mean, there's nothing I can go ahead and do about that. If they actually say, just go ahead and email me the information, well, wonderful. I put my best foot forward to have a strong turnover and a strong introduction to operations so they have a face to the name. But in addition to that turnover process, you do have to actually meet with your services team to have a conversation about, how am I going to rebook this client? So if you know that this is a really big account, a target account for your conference center, maybe it's a one-off booking and you know that they're utilizing the competition, well, then we do need to have a pre-planning meeting with ourselves and services and whoever else is going to be involved in this to actually talk about, how are we going to rebook this client? Because one thing that I know from my background of just working in hotels and events is, when I worked in conference services at a hotel, I was sometimes closer to the client than the salesperson was. Because sometimes sales, not saying you don't work hard, but sometimes you book it quickly, but then who actually gets the one-on-one time with the planner? It's the operations team, it's the services team. And what we find when you're in services, and when I was young in my career, is the same way. I'm just focused on this event. I just want to get all the details down. I want to get all your rooming list situated. I want to get all the meals sorted out, all the timing, all the AV needs, all of those things. But I'm not actually thinking about, what is the goal of this account? So if you really want to rebook this client, before it gets turned over, before even this turnover process, I do need to be sharing, what is the goal of this account? I know that they're bringing XYZ events to our competitor. I know that they have, 5 big events a year. We're just getting 1. I'd like to go ahead and get 3. Like, I got to be sharing that with the person, right? I got to be sharing, what is the overall potential? The other thing you want to share is actually, how do we win the business? As I said earlier, did we have to lower pricing dramatically to win the business? If that's the case, I better be sharing that with our services team, right? If I won the business because we did a creative site tour, that would also be something I would need to make sure to remind our team, right? Then other things you want to share is, who are the decision makers? Did you, during the sales process, did you actually have access to those decision makers? Sometimes I find that, yes, somebody signed off on the decision, but did you ever get the opportunity to speak with them and what was actually very important to them? But then in addition to that, who are some of those I like to say, decision influencers? Even though you might not be the person signing the contract, there still could be the meeting planner, the event planner, but who are those decision makers? If that decision maker, let's say they aren't actually involved in the sales process or the pre-planning process for the event, they actually might be coming on site for the meeting. So we do have to think about, who do we have to actually meet within this account while they're actually at the conference center? Like, are we even looking at the rooming list and going, wow, the CEO is coming and they actually had to sign off on the contract. How am I going to actually meet this person when they're actually on site? And I think that's something that we just, honestly, we don't think so much about there. But then also, what other venues are they using? Like, who is the competition? But then also, what other venues are they using if this is, if they're traveling in and, stuff like that. So if you think about all of this, this all leads into rebooking. So my favorite thing to do, you can do this when it comes to prospecting, you can do this when it comes to rebooking, is to do what I say is a no, don't know. Okay. Now, what is a no, don't know? With this account, what do you want to do is you want to write down, what is everything that I know about the account? Types of meetings they have, types of events, decision makers, their hot buttons, everything that you know. Future potential, if you know that. Then you want to write down, what is everything I don't know about this account? A lot of times things you wouldn't know is about sometimes future potential, maybe what other divisions within the company meet. Maybe if you are in a city or a destination, is there an opportunity for smaller meetings or business travel or holiday parties, since it is the holiday season right now? But then you got to think about, what do we need to find out? And when we are having our services team work with them, or when they're actually in our city or destination. See, what I find is if you're actually working, if you're on site and you are attending the meeting, let's say you're go down to greet the client, a lot of times we just go down. I said this earlier, we sit surface level. We go, so how's everything going? Is the food good? Okay, great. If you need anything, just want to put the face, the name. So nice to meet you. But did we actually ask the questions that we don't have the answers to? Wonderful. It's so great to meet you. Is there anybody else here that's attending that is also planning a meeting right now? I'd love to go ahead and we'll get into the feedback next, but I'd love to go ahead and hear, a little bit about, how the planning process was for the meeting. So that way you're developing these probing questions to get to whatever that root kind of cause is, to whatever the issue is, but to identify where those rebooking opportunities are. And sometimes you're asking those questions, sometimes your services team is. So here's what this actually might look like. We call this like account research. You write down, what do you know? But then you also write down, what don't you know? And then where are you going to do the research? Sometimes you can find out some of these items through a very, very simple online, online platform to look onto their website, corporate website, to go, okay, what other meetings do they plan? Are they a part of any non-for-profits? For example, do they do any, I was just looking at a hospital. So it's like with this hospital, what are their fundraising events and who are they fundraising for? Those would all be things that we would want to be looking for in that research kind of column there. So what I'd like you to go ahead and do is type into the chat box, and I might just call on somebody to go ahead and unmute. So then that way we can just go ahead and hear from you just a little bit. about, what are some of your best practices to rebook a client? What do you think can actually be improved in our rebooking process, like in your rebooking process? How do you think you can work a little bit better internally? I like to say, how do you follow up internally, but how can we work better together with our internal team in order to establish some of these kind of rebooking opportunities? And what I will do is, Erin, would you mind unmuting and maybe sharing with us some of your rebooking best practices, since you said prospecting is easier at the holidays, so you might have some comments right there.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you. Thank you for unmuting and sharing. But what are some of
course.
your strategies to rebooking, or maybe some ways you're going, wow, I could go back and work a little bit differently here?
I really, I like that you mentioned, obviously the importance of meeting the client on site. I think that getting a contract in their hand, just going right to the hard sell and saying, here's what I put together for next year. Just skip the proposal, skip the, RFP. Based on what you did this year, this is what next year, what we can offer for next year. How does that sound?
Perfect. And I love that. And as I said, the customer is not turned off by the hard sell, right? They actually like the hard sell because it makes their life a little bit easier. Any other thoughts, Erin, to share at all? She might have unmuted. That's perfectly fine. Thank you for sharing, Erin. How about Darcy? Do you want to unmute and share with us, perhaps kind of quickly, some of your strategies to rebook? And you can type these into the chat box too. So please feel free to go ahead and type in. But Darcy, how about we have you unmute and share if you're there? Oh. Are we there, Darcy? Okay, how about Morgan? Can you go ahead and unmute? I think you were there earlier. We'll kind of see here. Oh, okay, that's okay. We'll continue on then. Does anybody else have anything else that to put into the chat box? We only have one from S. Pratt's there. Not a lot on rebooking. Cindy or Sue, any kind of comments at all? They're at the top of my screen. So, okay. Yeah, so thanks, Karina. Karina said, plan ahead to ensure you have lunch or dinner, a dinner date planned with the client on site to get one-on-one time. That's always a great best practice, I would say, for sure. And making sure that you're actually scheduling that in advance, as you said. You can't just do it once they're there. Sometimes people don't have time, but that one-to-one time is definitely very, very much of your opportunity to make sure that you are asking some questions. Would anybody else like to share? Let me just kind of get some things I see. We got a couple other, I'm just kind of seeing, and feel free to come on camera too. It's kind of nice to see your face, right? So other things when it comes to rebooking is just to also remember that, there's no harm, as Erin had just said, there's really no harm in actually just pausing and just coming down with the contract and saying, I know things are going very well. If you've already heard some great things, I thought I'd go ahead and prepare the pricing for next year. Picked out a couple of dates that I think that it would actually work. And so let me know what some of your thoughts are, and just leave it right at that. I'd also encourage you to really think about how you can work a little bit better with your operations team, just to make sure that things are going very smoothly and that we're arming our operations team with some of those right questions to go ahead and ask there. So I see, Nicola said towards the end of the event, make sure you try to get an idea of the dates for the following year and let them know you'll check the diary. You can go back at the end of the day to tell them the following year dates, which is always a great best practice. And that also goes back even at the beginning of the sales process. If I have an understanding of, do they always have this meeting the first 2 weeks of November? Do they always have this event, in December? But maybe the date is a little bit flexible. That could also help you put together that proposal a little bit longer. Allison said you could ask to schedule a call in advance to have a debrief after the event. I find sometimes when you meet the client on site, they're busy. I 1000% agree with that. And I would encourage you to set that date if you know that they are going to be very busy, because we're going to get into that kind of post-con right now. We know that if they are going to be very busy, which is totally normal, because sometimes a meeting planner, I have so many friends that are meeting planners, they're flying in, their focus is on the event itself, and then they're flying right back out. So if you know that, setting up that debrief call in advance is always very important. Otherwise, people are like, oh yeah, email me, it's totally fine. And we'll set something up. But a lot of times these meeting planners, they're just on to the next gig. So we would encourage you to set up that debrief time a couple of weeks before the event. So you're on the date calendar, date and time, and on their calendar. So that's great. And then Erin, you mentioned the post-con, which is always great. Gregory, we often plan pre-con with the clients and operations team, but it's important to also plan a post meeting, preferably on the right after the event, to discuss what we did and, for next year, which is great. Jeannie, I love what you said. Add a level of urgency when rebooking. We're seeing an increasing in bookings for next fall. Wanted to put that on your radar. I love that. And even when it comes to some of that social business too, that is very important as we look at, I was just traveling a lot during the fall here in the US. And so like that fall foliage, a lot of people love that picturesque time of year to travel to some of your destinations or to escape certain times of year. So if you are seeing an increase of urgency within bookings of next year, or that dates are limited, we would encourage you to share that. So all good ideas. Thank you for going ahead and typing those in to the chat box there. So couple last comments here. Our last topic is to talk about the post-con, okay? And what I find, I remember when I worked on property, and even with our clients after training, for example, we do post-cons all the time. And I think we all know that why feedback matters, but what we really want to talk about is how can you create a post-con experience where the client really talks and you really get some of that real feedback. So I'll just use an example. I was at a meeting. This was just, when was this? This was just last week, okay? And I'm just the trainer, but people think sometimes you're in charge because I'm the audiovisual person. I'm managing the meeting, managing the breaks, essentially, although I'm not in charge of the BEO. But I had somebody come over, the salesperson did come down and say hi. And they said and so did the conference services person. They came down and asked me how everything was. And I'm just not the type of person, and I don't know if you're this way, to go ahead and complain. I'm kind of that person like, oh, I don't want to complain, but I kind of want to voice things. I kind of want to say things. And so they asked me like, how is everything going? I said, well, everything, it's good. Everything's been on time. Like it's good. But there were some things that were not so good. And I'll just use an example that I am pregnant right now. And I'm clearly, like you can tell now I'm pregnant. Sometimes you can't tell when you're pregnant. And on the buffet for lunch for 2 days, there wasn't a lot of options that had protein that I could actually eat within that you're supposed to eat when you're pregnant. But it was really difficult for me to bring that up. I'm not the one that selected the menus or anything, but clearly I'm pregnant. And then when they came in at lunch and all you see is like the chips and the cookies and that's all I'm eating and we're having a quick chat, well, we have to be a little bit more observant, right? Because what consumer research also shows us is that 50% of customers, they actually don't complain. They just take their business elsewhere. I call them walkers and talkers. Some people just walk right out the door and then never come back. And there's other people that will voice some of their concerns. And although everything was great, the food that I did have was delicious. The service was phenomenal. Everything was good. It just sometimes it's hard for me to, in general, like I don't want to speak up, probably because I used to be in their position. Thank you, Allison, too. They don't want to be in that position to not say anything. But also, we have to make sure that we are creating an environment that is very comfortable for people to speak up, right? Because if the client just sits service level and you do say, well, how's everything? And they just said, oh, yeah, it's great. Well, are you actually showing the client that their opinion is valued? Are we really getting them to talk? It goes back to asking some of those open-ended questions. We also want to focus on areas of improvement. How do we have that continuous areas of improvement on our services, on our facilities in order to actually get the client to actually repeat with us, right? To rebook and also then refer others, right? So when you look at structuring your feedback session, and it can be the post-con, which many of you just mentioned, that is what a feedback session is. But sometimes too, when I've sat in big formal post-cons, not every client is actually going to want to speak up in a big post-con, right? We want to make sure that we're preparing some very specific targeted questions based on the event details to actually get the client to talk. And what I find in a post-con sometimes, or in a post-feedback session, whatever it is that you actually want to say, what happens is we often leave it up to the client to lead the conversation. So we say, we would love your feedback, share with us everything that actually went well, or if there's any areas of improvement. And then they would do something that I would do. I would say a couple things that went well, maybe a thing here or there, but we're really not getting the client to talk about how happy they actually are. We aren't actually going, so would you rebook us, or what is that real feedback, right? So I always like to say you got to go back to what are some of those key questions to ask. One thing I don't always like to ask is I don't also like to focus on just negative things. Like, what could we improve on? Because that's already, or maybe that's not the right one, not necessarily what to improve on, but sometimes that goes into a negative connotation. So I would encourage you to think about questions that are positive, but then also get to whatever the root feedback is. So that way you can actually make some changes to the future. So here are some key questions to ask. How was your overall experience at the conference center? But then I like to say, walk me through the check-in experience. Walk me through the dinner experience. Walk me through the overall experience of the team building activity. Like, I'm getting some very targeted things where then people would say, oh yeah, the team building did start a little bit late, or the dinner, something was cold on the buffet. So you're getting them to talk. How did the facilities and services meet your expectations? Notice it's not just what can we improve as it relates to our services or facilities. How do they meet your expectations? If they had, let's say, a group that likes to exercise and work out, sometimes you wouldn't be asking probably a targeted question about the fitness center unless you knew that. So it's like, how did the facility services meet your expectations? How did our team support your event needs? Were there any, or what staff members stood out to you? Now, there may be a positive in there, and there could be maybe some of the not so great. And just remember, when you ask the question, that you have to focus in on the answer. So what could we do to enhance your future events with us? That's my way of saying, what could we improve on, right? What can we do to enhance? And they say, well, maybe more creativity in your menus. Well, remember, you have to focus in on that answer. What do you mean by creativity in the menus, right? What can we change in the future? And my favorite one is, how can I actually earn your business in the future? Like, sometimes it's just as simple as that, of going, what can I do to go ahead and earn your business? But just remember, you want to pick up on what are people's overall, I like to say, like, what's their overall feeling? Okay. So for me, for example, as I said, I might go, yeah, everything, it was good. The food was good. Maybe a little bit more variety. You're going to have to ask me some of those follow-up questions to really get me to talk. Okay. So what I'd like you to do, as we kind of our last kind of couple minutes here, is just back into the chat box, is just go ahead and type in what questions can you ask, and what are some of your questions you like to ask in your post-cons to uncover what we say is like the real feedback. Like, whatever are your go-to questions or things that you're kind of going, gosh, this is a question I'd like to ask. But back to getting people to talk is just remember, even when people say, how can I earn your business? And they say, well, I don't really have much going on in the future, or I'm not really too sure. Well, that might mean that they're actually not that excited to rebook you. So you have to make sure that you're actually gathering some of that information and getting them to kind of chat and so forth. So go ahead and type those in. Jeannie said, how do you navigate asking, what can we do to enhance for your future if the answers are not within your means or service offerings? Can you just unmute and give me an example of what wouldn't be in your services or offerings? Jeannie, I think that would be something that would be helpful to just know.
Yeah, absolutely, Mary. So just thinking about, like, I try to avoid those questions typically when giving feedback because I don't want to be, given feedback that we can't actually meet within our needs. So trying to think about, we do our Chef's Choice lunch buffet. And so we do that to make sure that all of the groups in our building all have access to the Chef's Choice lunch, but we don't give, we don't allow clients to not necessarily pick that. And so that's a lot of feedback we get in that, oh, people want to pick their menus, and we have some alternatives to that, but that's not something that we can always meet. So I think what I'm trying to figure out is a good tactic to asking that question, but not having to retort immediately back with, no, that's not an option we can do.
Totally. So this is, I say that's like an objection. It's a barrier to the close. So whenever they say, well, we'd love to go ahead and pick our menus, you have to go back and asking questions. So the first thing is you always acknowledge what the person said. So I completely understand. You want to pick your menus and you don't have to go into the functionality. You don't have to go into, well, we do a chef selection because of this and it's chef's choice. Don't go into any of that. But what I would do is go into asking some questions. So I would say, absolutely, completely understand you want to pick your menus or have a little bit more customization to your menus. Let me ask you, what was your feedback on our menus? Each day that you dine for lunch, what was missing? Because this is where, again, if they're bringing up something negative, what would you have liked to see on our menus? How did the menus every day at lunch meet your expectations? Because maybe what they're actually looking for is a little bit more theme or a little bit more something. But if you actually ask them questions, they say, oh, we thought the menus were great. Well, then what's the issue? But if there was something that was missing, that would be very valuable feedback that you could go back and actually give to the chef. So again, don't just let it sit surface level to go, oh, well, it's chef selection and all of that. Maybe that perhaps they had, well, I'll just use an example. Maybe half the group were all vegans and there wasn't enough vegan options on the buffet that we actually had set up. Well, then that's a bigger problem, right? So whenever you get any of that, I just encourage you to brainstorm. What are those lists of 3, 4, or 5 other questions I can ask to get them to talk about, in this case, our lunch buffet, to make sure that they're actually happy with the offerings, or if there is something that's missing, because that feedback could go directly back to the chef. Is that kind of helpful to hear?
Yes, thanks, Mary.
Perfect. No, that's a great question. And just remember, I like to say, don't be scared of the answers, because I'm actually happy if they're bringing that up. If they really do want to pick their menu, and although it might not be possible, I like to say, well, anything's possible with the price. So if they want to pick the menu, well, then there's going to be a premium price for that. Just like at a hotel, we know a lot of hotels also do a chef selection every day. They do like a menu of the day, which is, you're already doing that. They do a menu of the day too and offer some sort of discount. So you just want to make sure you're getting some of that feedback of maybe it's the themed or maybe it's something very specific that they wanted to incorporate, which probably could be done. But feel free to type in any other kind of questions as we begin to wrap up and wrap up in general. But back to what I just had said, just to kind of some closing comments. And if we have any other last questions, feel free to type those in and we'll start to begin to wrap up. Is that when you're doing these post-cons, and as Jeannie said, even when they throw out this objection, just make sure that you avoid, and I don't think that any single one of you is defensive, but avoid being defensive. Sometimes we're just like, well, that's just the way we work, so we can't necessarily change the menus. Well, that's not actually being helpful, right? What we want to do is thank the client for their input. Thank you so much for sharing that you actually would like to pick out your menus. Let's go back to our lunch buffet. What was missing? What was well? What would you like to see in the future? Because although the chef may have a certain way they like to do things, we can always make sure that we could actually provide a positive experience for the next time, right? But when it comes to creating engagement, making sure that you're paraphrasing, you're summarizing to show understanding. If there is any issues, outline the next steps. So in this case, it would be, I'm going to give this feedback to our chef. What I'd love to go ahead and do is have him brainstorm some options of how next year we can make your menus maybe a little bit more of a variety or cater more to a healthier focus, whatever they said. But I so appreciate that feedback because sometimes it could be a big deal, but sometimes it could be maybe not so big of a deal. And then obviously when it comes to rebooking, some of you had said we would then be scheduling a phone appointment or some sort of appointment after the event. Absolutely. So you do have to think about what are those next steps. It is sending the thank you email, summarizing those key points and actions. It's reinforcing what we did very well at the event. Thank you so much for your feedback. I'm so happy that you enjoyed whatever. And then if there was some follow-up about the menus, we'd be talking about that follow-up. And of course, you can offer incentives or personalized packages for some of those future events there. So when it comes to rebooking, just to remember is don't forget to close. That's the most important part. It's asking for the business with confidence, with conviction, not pushy or aggressive. But as we said, we can make this easy for the client. How do you make this easy for the client? It's very, very simple. Have the contract prepared, look into dates already, and making sure that the other thing that's very important is that if you brought them a contract, let's say when they were on site, if you actually don't set a date and time that you're going to follow up with them on that contract, we know that your chances of closing the deal have now decreased dramatically. When you set a date and time that you're going to follow up, whatever that next step is, your chances of closing the deal, I got to look back at the stat, it like increases 50% or something. So it is insane if you just say, here's the contract and let me know. It should never be let me know. It should be, let me go ahead and follow up with you next week. What day works well to go through the feedback and talk about next year. So in conclusion, we talked about some best practices to rebook the client while they're on property. We talked a little bit about how we can work better with sales and operations to maximize rebooking opportunities, and then kind of looking at those real feedback sessions. And even if there's things that are negative, how can we make sure that they leave happy and rebook? So with that, do we have any questions or anything at all? We're right at our time. I'll stop sharing my screen here so you can see me a little bit bigger. But do we have any other last minute questions at all that we can go ahead and answer for you? And so forth.
Mary, I had a follow-up question. We were
course.
talking about just like timelines for rebooking, and we were talking heavily about the holidays being a good time just because it's a good downtime. Are there any other time frames throughout the year or trends that you've seen with rebooking where it's kind of that sweet spot for reaching out to clients if right after the event's not the best time to do so?
Yeah, I think that depends on the client's business and what are their cycles. So that would also be a question you could ask is like, what is their busy time? What is their non-busy time? Like, for example, if it is a retail client, this time of year is a terrible time to be reaching out. If there's any e-commerce that you're doing business with, anything as it relates to retail, they're all worried about their Black Fridays and their Cyber Mondays and all of these things. So that can be very cyclical, I think, which is important. One thing that we do know is that when it comes to prospecting, typically Mondays and Fridays are the worst days to actually prospect because Mondays people come into work, they're really geared up. Fridays tend to be also like people are halfway out the door. So those particular dates, depending also on who you're prospecting in the region, are not the best. But actually what we find for time of day of actually getting a response is typically going to be in a lunch hour time, depending on where you are in the world, whatever time most people take lunch. That 2-hour time is a good time to be emailing and calling because a lot of times people aren't taking a formal lunch and they're getting less emails when people are at lunch or even after 5 p.m. Because at 5 p.m., their assistant leaves or whoever answers their phone leaves, people are more likely to answer their phone. So those are kind of some things when it comes to time. And I see in here that Lindsay had asked for their fiscal year because sometimes that determines their rebooking window, which is also important. It's like, we know, like, when's your budget season? I always like to ask, like, what are their budget seasons? So that as you're putting together the contract, you also have that. Erin said you could also reach out when they sent out the RFP the previous year. I would always recommend whenever they send out the RFP, reach out about a month to 6 weeks prior, because that means if you're reaching out right at the same time, if they put in the lead the first week of December last year, well, then they're already at the sourcing phase, right? So they're already looking at where to put in that lead. So we like to say six weeks, like prior to that, is typically a good time. So hopefully that was helpful.
That was, thank you, Mary.
Of course. What other questions? Anybody else like to unmute and ask any questions at all? Perfect. Okay, Kate, I'll turn it back over to you for any closing comments.
Thanks, Mary, and a big thank you from everyone for a great session. I'm already getting feedback in the chat box with really positive feedback, so thank you for that. That was our last webinar for 2024, believe it or not. If you have missed any of our sessions with Master Connection Associates, do check our webinar on demand page, where you can see all the recordings, and also on the IACC YouTube channel. We're just about to launch the 2025 sessions. We have some fantastic sessions coming that we haven't delivered before with MCA. So we look forward to seeing you next year. Keep an eye on the website and your emails. And I wish you all, my American friends, a very happy Thanksgiving, and everyone else, all the best and happy holidays.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of the 2024.